Welcome to Small Space Vegetable Gardening. I'm Taylor Trent, an Extension Scholar with the University of Delaware Cooperative Extension, and it is my pleasure to introduce today's instructor, Gail Hermenau. Gail is a master gardener, master composter, and master food educator. She has been a volunteer educator for University of Delaware's Cooperative Extension since 2004. As a member of the Workshop and Speakers Bureau Committee, she presents workshops on composting, healthy soil, seed starting, and a variety of vegetable gardening topics. She also volunteers as a member of the Community and School Gardens Committee, helping community members to both establish community-led vegetable gardens and to provide education in growing vegetables and managing their materials through on-site composting. All right, Gail, and I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Thanks, Taylor. To begin, a well-tended small garden can produce a variety of vegetables for you to enjoy. It just requires a bit of planning to get the most out of your space. This workshop will focus on ways you can manage your garden to maximize your production. Since you'll be using planting methods such as succession, companion, interplanting, and intensive planting, planning ahead is important. Think of what you want to grow. Do you want a spring garden, a summer garden, or a three-season garden? Peruse the vegetable seed catalogs and think of your plant selections. Draw it out on paper first. It's easier to organize your plant choices on paper first before seeding and transplanting. Once you've decided your seasonal garden, the type of vegetables you want to grow, and the amounts, it makes planning your planting schedule easier. When thinking about your garden, how much space do you have to devote to growing? Think about the types of vegetables you'll be growing. Different vegetables have different space requirements. For example, tomatoes need a larger area for the plants to reach maturity and have proper air circulation than, say, radishes or lettuce. Before you start digging, do a site assessment of your yard. How much space do you have to devote to growing vegetables? You don't need a large space. Many vegetable varieties can grow in a small space. Make a list of the vegetables you would like to grow and research the size of each plant at maturity. This will determine the seasonal planting as well as the amount of space used in the garden plot. Picking the perfect spot. No matter what size your garden is, you'll need 3 basic requirements for success: full sun, water, and good soil. Close to the house for easy access is best. It saves time and makes things easier to maintain. As you assess your spot, make sure this area has 6 to 8 hours of full sun. Your vegetables will also need an inch of water a week to grow well. Site your spot as close to your water source as you can, making watering easier. You'll appreciate this when the heat index rises, and so will your plants. Then most important, good soil. Good soil is the backbone of your garden. You want to have well-drained, fertile soil. Make sure your spot doesn't have any standing water after a rain shower. Other considerations: what's growing in the soil now? Is there grass, sod, weeds? Was there a previous vegetable crop? Were chemicals used to control weeds and insects? Were chemical fertilizers used? Was there a pest infestation the previous year? Could they possibly have wintered over? Collect as much information as possible about your site before planting begins. Address any concerns now before you begin, and this will eliminate the need for constant intervention down the road. If plant-specific pests were in that space, you want to use crop rotation as a method to control pests. Soil health is important for any garden, but especially if you're growing annual vegetable crops. A healthy soil, rich in nutrients, will support the growth and fruiting of vegetables all season long. So you want to know your soil: clay, silt, sand, loam. What percentages of these do you have? What's your texture and structure? You want to know your pH level. You want to know your soil biology. What's happening in your soil? This can be achieved by taking a soil test and specify the vegetable crops you'll be growing and follow the recommendation in your soil test results. You want to pay attention to the pH level and the organic matter in your results and make any recommended adjustments. Most vegetables do well in soil that is moist, well-drained, and rich in organic matter, with a pH of 6.8 to 7.0. There are some vegetables, like beets, for example, that prefer a pH of 5.5. So if you will be planting beets, preparing your soil ahead of planting is beneficial. An addition of compost before planting will benefit all your vegetable crops. Healthy soil will equal healthy plants. Now that you've selected the best site possible for your garden, you can decide on your layout. Row cropping or intensive planting are two basic approaches for growing vegetables for both raised beds and in-ground production. Match the garden to your site. Consider the amount of labor and maintenance involved, and consider the space needed overall and the space needed for the different crops that you'll be growing. Row cropping and intensive gardening are two methods to use for either in-ground production or raised bed gardening. Row cropping is just that. You plant your crops in a row. This type of garden layout uses pathways in between each crop, allowing for space to work, apply amendments, mulch, and harvest. This is a traditional way of growing vegetables. This works best for vegetables that are happy growing next to each other and have similar cultural requirements, and that are harvested out, then replanted in the space. Row cropping is a nice way to sow succession crops all year round. They can be harvested out and a new crop sown without disturbing any of your crop neighbors that will be in the ground longer. Vegetables that work well using this method are lettuces, radish, arugula, spinach, turnips, and other salad greens. Tomatoes, for instance, require more space in between each plant for good air circulation. And squash and cucumbers, they like to vine and spread. Before planting, you must consider the interrelationships of your plants, including their nutrient needs, shade tolerance, above and below ground growth patterns, and preferred growing season. Using specific techniques, you can develop a high yield intensive garden. When spacing plants of the same plant family, they will require the same cultural needs, soil, water, nutrients, etc. But they will need closer monitoring as the same pests attack the same plant families. So when you're planting close together, they can easily move from plant to plant, spreading disease and eating plant material. So companion planting techniques and integrated pest management practices are especially beneficial. If you love to grow tomatoes and you want to grow some in your garden, keep in mind the size of the plant at maturity, as well as spacing between each plant. Tomatoes require space in between for good air circulation. This will help to keep disease at bay and from spreading. If you choose to plant potatoes, for example, while they can be planted in the ground early, that space will need to remain free of other plant material so that they can continue to grow above the ground and stay in that space until harvest time, usually around the end of July, beginning of August, depending on the variety. So think of how much of a crop you want all season long. Some vegetables can grow in spring, harvest out, a different summer vegetable taking its place and then pulled at the end of the season, and a new fall planting of a third vegetable takes its place. Or if you want fresh lettuce and radishes all season long, devote that space to a continual crop all throughout the growing season. If your space is small, you want to choose compact varieties. There are many compact varieties in the market to choose from, allowing for traditional large summer vegetables to grow on a smaller sized plant with smaller fruit, but with all the flavor of the vegetables that you love. Spacing is really important for the size of the plant at maturity. This is a bed that was planted at planting time, and then this one is the bed that was planted and grown to almost maturity. You can see from these slides that there was a lot of spacing in between the lettuce and the turnips to begin with, but then they filled in very quickly. And then when the turnips are ready to be harvested, they'll make room for the lettuce next to it that is ready to move to have more room to grow. Spacing is very important at planting time for the plant at maturity, but some plants can be planted closer together for a harvest of small baby onions and leeks and beets You can harvest the small baby beets, for example, and then that opens up some space for a larger harvest at maturity. I use this method with onions and leeks, as shown in this photo. And instead of harvesting all the way down the row, I harvest every other one. I use the baby onions or leeks or beets in the kitchen when I only need small amounts. When I harvest out baby beets, I also eat the small beet greens at the same time. So I have two crops that I'm harvesting. And then once they're harvested out of that space, it provides additional room available for larger growth later, and I get a second harvest of my onions, leeks, and beets. You can accomplish interplanting by alternating rows within a bed. Sometimes you can mix plants within a row, or by distributing a variety of species throughout the bed. Alternating rows is really the easiest to manage. Long season, slow maturing, and short season, quick maturing plants like carrots and radishes can be planted at the same time. Radishes are harvested before they begin to crowd out the carrots. An example of combining growth patterns is planting smaller plants close to larger plants, like radishes at the base of beans or broccoli. Shade-tolerant species like lettuce and spinach may be planted in the shadow of taller crops. And heavy feeders such as cabbage, anything in the cabbage family, can be mixed with lighter feeding plants. Root, leaf, and soil building crops can be mixed to take advantage of available nutrients. This slide is a photo of a carrot and lettuce combination. It was planted in the spring. The lettuce was grown and harvested out by the time the carrots required more space. Carrots really take up a lot of space in the garden, and so that eliminates a large area for you to take advantage of succession planting. So early in the spring, when I put my carrots in, I put in lettuce also, so I can take advantage of that space early on. And then when the lettuce is harvested out and the carrots are ready to be thinned, then that entire space is just devoted for the carrots to continue to grow to maturity, and then they're usually harvested in the fall. Planting a spring, summer, and fall garden is another form of succession planting. Cool season crops like broccoli, lettuce, and peas can be followed by a warm season crop of beans, tomatoes, and peppers, and where possible, these may be followed by more cool season plants or even a winter cover crop. If you manage your growing space this way, you will have a continuous harvest throughout the entire season. You want to think of these key things. You want to keep on seeding. One of the easiest ways to practice succession planting is to keep on seeding. Continually sowing will produce a staggered harvest of crops that work well, like lettuce, radish, arugula, and bush beans. When I sow these in my garden, when I harvest out the head lettuce, I always follow with continuing to seed that row, so I have new lettuce ready to be harvested. And it's a very quick crop, lettuce and radishes. I can get another harvest in as much as 20 to 40 days. You want to pick and sow. This method allows you to grow a continuing series of vegetables in the same space. Crops that work well for this are broccoli, lettuce, tomatoes, radishes, kale, or chard. By planting a spring crop, you can follow it with a summer crop and then with a fall crop in the same space, growing a variety of vegetables using a small amount of space. I also like to stagger cultivars. By selecting varieties that mature at different times, you can plant the same crop in the same space using an early maturing variety, followed by a summer variety, and then followed finally by a variety that does really well, only grown in the fall. Vegetables that work well for this are your cool season crops, and with a variety that is slow to bolt in the summer and that can tolerate higher temperatures. Plan in advance. The more planning, the more successful. Make a list of what you want to grow, write down the expected planting dates and the number of days to harvest. Keep a journal or a record. This information is very useful so that you have your next crop ready for sowing or transplanting, and buy all your seeds at the start of the season. You want to start more seedlings. By mid-May, when the warm season vegetables are in the ground, you want to think about planting your succession crop for fall. Start seedlings in a flat from mid-June for an August planting and a fall harvest. Whether you purchase them as transplants or whether you're starting them on your own, you want to make sure you get your timing just right. And then you want to feed your soil. In between all of this production of a intensively planted garden, you want to make sure you add like an inch layer of compost to your garden in between your succession crops. Turning over crops quickly. Don't leave anything long in the ground. If it starts to decline or has a pest problem, pull it right out. Practice good hygiene and use crop rotation. Another way is to plant lettuces in space harvesting until the middle of the summer and follow that with a planting of kale in the space and harvest until frost. Or you can try your hand at wintering over a fall crop. Another tip to keep in mind is what crop will you be ending your season on, especially if you would like to winter over that crop. But even if you're just going to be putting your garden to bed and sheet composting, one that has typically pest problems that might be wintered over, you want to try to plant your final crop that's relatively pest-free, just in case any of those pests could winter over and return in the spring when spring cool season planting begins again. So that's another reason why planning is really important. What crop is going to follow the previous one? And another technique you can take advantage of to make the most of your small space is vertical gardening. Vertical gardening will allow space for production of an intensely planted space. Plants grown vertically occupy less space on the ground, and though the yield may not be the same, it might be a little lower, but not always, because now they have a lot of varieties designed to be planted and supported on a trellis. Your yield per square foot of your garden space will be high because vertically grown plants are more exposed than non-stake plants. They will dry out a little quicker. They may need to be watered more frequently, but this fast drying is also an advantage to those that might be susceptible to fungal diseases. When using a trellis, spinach and lettuce can be planted underneath for a quick crop and provide shade to help prevent bolting in the summer. Companion planting. This technique is a valuable tool to use in an intensively planted garden. It draws on common sense, traditional practices, and scientific research. It's especially helpful to an organic grower. When planting close together, remember the plant's physical needs when planting your combinations. Deeply rooted or shallow rooted, compact or a spreader. Planting is important to the size of your garden. The vegetable's physical needs in the space will determine the variety. The three sisters concept is what most people think of when they think of companion planting. Corn grows tall to support the beans. Beans fix nitrogen and provides nutrients for the corn, and squash vines on the ground. It acts as mulch to retain moisture and shades the soil and reduces weeds. This is probably what you think of when you hear the term companion planting, the above ground interactions between different plants. Tomatoes and carrots grow well together. Basil and tomatoes grow well together. And cabbage and carrots and cucumbers grow well with beans. However, not all companions are helpful. Some plant combinations are destructive. For instance, onions are said to be a bad companion for peas and beans. You could also interplant your garden with herbs and flowers that may repel pests or act as a trap crop and also attract beneficial insects. Flea beetles, for instance, will attack beans and radishes and eggplant alike. So if the crop you're most interested in is beans, plant a row of radishes around them to hopefully keep them off your beans. Sometimes this works if you only have a small amount of pests on that plant. If there's enough radishes and other crops for them to support their populations, they will usually stay away from the beans. The pH of your soil's different plants' needs when planting combinations is important also. You want to take the pH level of each plant to grow well into consideration since they'll be planted closely together. You want to think about heavy feeders and light feeders. That's a really nice combination. If you have a really heavy feeder, to plant a light feeder next to it, they work really well together. Or if you want to put all of your heavy feeders in one bed or one portion of your in-ground production, where you can just concentrate on providing extra nutrients to that area and keeping your light feeders separated on their own, that will work well also. So you want to know your cool season and your warm season vegetables. Cool season vegetables are the vegetables that may be grown in the early spring and then again in fall. These types of vegetables germinate and grow well in cooler temperatures. When planting your garden, you want to keep in mind that your fall crop will go in the ground in the first 2 weeks of August. Careful planting will take advantage of interplanting under the shade of a summer crop so that it can be harvested out in time for the fall crop to have more room to grow. It shades the soil and makes it a bit cooler, and this will help with its germination. Some of the types of vegetables that can be grown in both the spring and fall, since they're cool season crops, would be kale, chard, anything in the cabbage family. And then your warm season vegetables. Warm season vegetables need warmer temperatures day and night to germinate and grow well. They're usually larger, vining, and take up more space. In planting, you need to reserve the space needed, either using trellising techniques and placing in beds next to a good companion for a long season's growth. The vegetables that are warm season vegetables are your cucumbers, your tomatoes, your squash, and your peppers. Plan a variety of selections is important when you are intensively planting a space. When choosing varieties, bred to grow in small spaces, you want to look for words like patio, pixie, small, compact, tiny, baby, or dwarf in their name. Often, just because the plant is bred to be small, it doesn't mean that the fruits will be small or yield less, but you want to make sure that you don't expect to grow a big mama beefsteak that can reach 6 feet tall in a small space. There are many smaller varieties on the market now that you can grow if you have a limited space that are disease resistant and very flavorful. Here's just a list of some of the varieties. Cucumbers, the salad bush. If you don't have a trellising system or space to trellis, they are compact bush plant that produces really well. I've grown that before, as well as Space Master and Pickle Bush. If you would like to grow eggplant, Bambino or Slim Jim are some of the varieties that are smaller and narrow, but just as flavorful. And actually, they have beautiful varieties that come in a variety of colors, white and light purple and striped and a rose that look really beautiful in the garden. Green beans, pole beans will give you a higher yield. So if you want to grow beans and you have a small space, you maybe want to choose pole beans. The varieties like Blue Lake, Kentucky Wonder, and French Dwarf are great. Small green onions like evergreen bunching grow really well just on the edge of your garden bed or in between some other larger plants. Leaf lettuce like your butter crunch or your small bib size can trim an entire raised bed and produce really nicely around the edges. And then your peppers, you could grow some of the smaller ones like Cubanelle, sweet banana, jalapeno. Those are often very successfully grown in a small space. Many growers now produce seeds and plants for the garden in small compact varieties. So when looking and purchasing your seeds that you're going to direct sow in the garden, you want to read the back of your seed packet or the description in your catalog to make sure that you know what the size of the plant will be at maturity before you plant it in that space. There's some vegetables that do really well being direct sown in the garden, and these are lettuce, radish, beans, chard, carrots, beets. Some tips for successful direct sowing. Seeds germinate well when there is good seed to soil contact. It's very helpful if you moisten the soil area that will be seeded before placing the seeds in the ground. And then after planting the seeds in the ground, make sure that they go in the proper depth as indicated on the seed packet. And then you want to water those seeds in gently and then cover with the soil layer and then water that again gently. So this gives the seeds really nice moisture content to start off with. You don't want to allow the soil to dry out in between watering. This is important for germination. They will need evenly moist soil until sprouting begins. So I find if I do it this way, it just is worth paying a little bit of attention at the time that you're seeding so that you're sure that the seed coat has proper moisture as soon as you put it into the ground. Sometimes when you're watering, it will take a while for all that water to filter through to hit that seed coat to be able to soften it up for germination to happen. So this tip, is really helpful, especially when you're intensively planting a space and you want to move crops fast. When you're transplanting, some vegetables really do better as a transplant. Whether you purchase them or you start your own, you want to make sure that they have a good root system and at least 2 sets of true leaves before planting. It takes transplants a while to get acclimated to their new environment and the roots to anchor themselves in. So they're very fragile at this stage. You want to be careful about forceful watering or heavy rain. Vegetables that need to be planted as a transplant are broccoli, cabbage, and tomatoes, for example. An overcast, cloudy day is perfect for transplanting to minimize the stress on your seedlings. Care and maintenance. Maintaining an intensively planted garden is a little different than your basic care and maintenance. Because you'll be moving your crops in and out faster, you need to regularly amend your soil with an addition of compost at planting time. You want to follow a light feeder after harvesting out a heavy feeder. Supply steady moisture to the newly seeded rows for germination, and an addition of compost will increase your soil's water holding capacity. This will benefit your newly seeded and transplanted areas. Since your plants are growing closely together, it's important to monitor for pests and disease before they spread from one crop to another, and to take the necessary measures to keep it under control. When watering, proper watering is very important in the vegetable garden, not only for continued growth and fruiting, but for good garden hygiene. You want to always water from below. You want to water the soil and the root area, not the plant and the leaves from above. An average of 1 inch a week is needed in the vegetable garden, but as you plant a succession of crops, they will require more water. Depending on the weather, you want to make sure that you always check the root zone before watering. Wind and weather and other factors can dry out the soil quickly. You want to make sure that the water is just not on the surface. Sometimes when you just view your vegetable garden, it looks nice and moist on top. So you want to make sure that you move some of that soil over or stick your finger into the root zone area to see if that water really filtrated and penetrated in that root area. And then it's helpful if you can time the amount of time it took for that to happen, so that you know you need at least that amount of time to take care of all of your watering in your garden throughout the season. You want to use organic mulches to conserve water moisture. When you have an intensively planted garden, it'll also need more attention to your proper watering procedures as your crops are closer together and the spread of disease is easier. So think about your garden layout and your successive crops when planting. If you use soaker hoses or drip irrigation, you can choose some of these watering tools, like row crop production will make it easier. If you're going to lay that drip tape down and water an entire bed that way, then you want to make sure that you plant your plants all along the lines of the drip tape that's going to be irrigating that. If you're going to use a soaker hose, you have a little more flexibility with that. I use that when I grow my tomatoes because I want to make sure that I keep any fungal disease off the leaves as much as possible. I wind a soaker hose all around the tomatoes I have planted in a row, and then I just attach my hose to that. And in the very beginning, you know, as things are growing, I time to see how much water it took to penetrate down to the root area. But then you'll want to adjust that as the season goes on, as that plant starts to flower and fruit. You want to make sure that it has all the nutrients moving through that water source to provide the best possible type of fruit setting possible. And so I find that that's a little more flexible to work with because the size of the tomato plants. So you want to think about your garden layout and your succession crops when you're planting, because if you had drip tape laid in rows, and then you want to plant something else in that spot where you're not going to be laying it out in a row, then you're going to have to realign your entire drip system. So you want to keep that in mind. But you can always take advantage of these types of watering sources in a variety of ways, even in a raised bed. So one of the things that I do is I make sure that I always mulch my spaces really well to conserve water. I have a pretty windy site, and so the surface moisture of my soil dries out pretty quickly. So I make sure that when I'm watering, I water really deeply, and that supports healthy root growth. And I'll make sure that I use organic mulches to conserve that moisture and conserve some water. And so these are the kinds of things in your regular care and maintenance of your garden that you want to stay on top of, you want to monitor, you want to make sure things are going well and make any changes necessary. If you're interested in more information on a variety of irrigation techniques, you can look for an upcoming workshop from Master Gardener Rick Judd. And harvesting. Proper harvesting procedure is very important in an intensely planted garden. It's done in a few different ways. Depending on your crop, you can cut and come again, harvest out completely, resow a crop, and then you could also be just cutting off the fruit only, just as in tomatoes and cucumbers. So you want to be careful that you don't pull. This is especially important for tomatoes and cucumbers and beans. The pulling at the plant can damage any of the flowers that are there, and that will eliminate any future harvest that you might have. You want to carefully harvest and not to disturb the plants nearby. So often, if I'm going to be using a crop where I'm going to be constantly cutting and coming again, like leaf lettuce, or I'm going to be harvesting out like head lettuce, I try and put that row at the edge of the bed so I don't really have to reach in very far and possibly disturb any of the other plants that are planted next to it. I can just come along to the edge of the bed, trim some lettuce, and then not disturb anything too much. The timing, you want to make sure that you pick your beans before you see the seeds bulging. You want to continue to harvest your beans to continue bean production. When the beans are ready to be pulled, they need to be pulled. Whether you want to have them for dinner that night or not, you need to pick the beans. If you stop picking the beans will form heavy seeds, go to seed, stop producing flowers, and it will be a signal to the plant that they need to preserve their seeds for their life. So picking the beans is really important. Even if you have, you know, an abundance of beans one day, you got to get out there and pick them. You can, you know, blanch them and freeze them. You can share them with your neighbors. But if you stop picking the beans and don't harvest them at the proper harvesting time, you know, you won't have a future harvest down the road. And beans are something that you can continually harvest throughout the season, really successfully, all the way until frost. So you got to remember to get out there and pick the beans. You want to check everything frequently, because a day of really warm temperatures can change a plant's fruit production really quickly. Broccoli, for instance, the part of the plant that we're eating is the unopened flower buds. So you want to check that frequently, especially in the warmer weather, because that is a cool season crop. So when the weather gets warm, the heads will start to bloom. So you want to pick that before the heads start to bloom. You'll see that the little green buds will open up and even maybe turn like a little yellowish, and you might even see little yellow flowers on there. So, you know, you want to make sure that you harvest that broccoli before that happens. Summer squash, You want to pick it young and small and check it often. Summer squash like zucchini and golden squash can quickly grow to a large seedy size. Sometimes you go out there and you think, well, I just looked at those squash and cucumbers thinking I would harvest them in another day or two, and then the next day you go out there and they're tremendous. So looking at your vegetables as harvest time starts will help you pick the best, freshest vegetables from your garden. And here are some books that I thought you might be interested in reading if you'd like some more information about any of the techniques that I talked about today. We also have some information on vegetable gardening that you could find fact sheets on specific vegetables and how to grow them at the Extension website, which is at extension.udel.edu. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and happy gardening.